Welcome to this RISE Learning Machines seminars. RISE is Sweden's research institute with activities in everything between bioeconomy to digital systems. The computer science department works on applied AI projects for the benefit of society, and we organize the weekly Learning Machines seminars. This seminar will be recorded, and if anyone wants to be removed from this recording, just let us know. Many previous great talks are available on our YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Sara Beery, who is a researcher at Google Research and incoming assistant professor at MIT, where she will work in the EECS and the CSAIL. Sara had her PhD in 2021 in computing and mathematical sciences at Caltech, advised by Pietro Perona, and she received the Amori Doctoral Prize for this dissertation. Sara works on computer vision for environment and biodiversity monitoring and tackling challenges such as domain shift, imperfect data quality, fine-grained categories, long-tail distributions. The topic today is Auto Arborist towards mapping urban forests across North America. And with that said, Sara, the word is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, so it's cool to hear that at RISE, you guys have also been thinking a lot about some of these environmental challenges and the intersection with computer science. And I think I'm just generally really excited to see how much growth there is in this space. And I'm excited to see what we can sort of do at the international scale as we sort of all find each other and come together and work together on some of these really big and truly global problems. So today I'm going to be talking about what's essentially my postdoc project that I'm working on currently at Google before I start my faculty job. And so this project is really focused on trying to figure out how to get better understanding of urban forests, but also from a computer science perspective. It's a project that for me, I initially got interested in because it's trying to capture multimodality that's heterogeneously sampled, trying to bring in different types of data that maybe are accessible in different ways in a given region. So this is a common scenario with a lot of environmental or biodiversity problems, like maybe you have some network of camera traps, maybe you have a few bioacoustic sensors, you have some transects, you have satellite imagery. And often we really treat each of these modalities very separately. And so what we're trying to figure out is what are the values of some of these different types of data? And in this case, we're talking about ground level images and aerial images. And in terms of both coverage, so, aerial data, you get pretty good coverage temporally from lower resolution satellite. And then maybe sometimes you get a higher resolution like EOS flight. And then, this again, like much richer in terms of the visual information, ground level data, but that's only available some of the time and for some places. And I think hopefully one day we can kind of take what we're studying here in urban forests and possibly move to wilderness forests, but in a scenario where now the ground level data is provided by something like camera trap networks and wildlife insights.
Sara?
So,
Sara?
urban forests actually in and of themselves are really worth studying, particularly
Sara?
as, yeah.
We see a black screen. Now we see a slide. Yeah, benefits of the urban forest.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks for letting me know. So urban forests are actually very, very interesting in and of themselves. So we're currently seeing the world urbanize more and more. There's over 4 billion people worldwide that live in cities, in urban environments. And within those urban environments, access to green space, the presence and the diversity of trees and other plants are really important for these sort of fragile ecosystems that are preserved in cities. And so trees in particular really help support that regional biodiversity that you would see in a given city. They provide connected habitat for a rich array of wildlife. But they also reduce air pollution, they sequester carbon, they reduce energy use, and they've been shown to help reduce extreme heat islands, which, as we're seeing more and more climate extremes going forward, and we're already seeing some pretty detrimental effects of these extreme heat islands in cities, it seems very prevalent to try to actually build natural infrastructure to help reduce the effect of those. And they're also shown to have benefits for both physical and mental health of those who live in cities. Now, unfortunately, these benefits are really not accessible to everyone. And part of that really ties into what's considered, or what's called, environmental justice, the historical and sort of societal structures that have built inequity into our cities. And there's a lot of different results of this, but one is that wealthy neighborhoods like Pasadena, where I went and did my PhD at Caltech, is incredibly green. It's beautiful. You can see there's just a huge volume of urban trees in Pasadena. But if you move to Carson, which is nearby, also in the greater Los Angeles area, an area that is much more socioeconomically disadvantaged, you can see that that access to trees really drops off. And a lot of cities are very interested in actually explicitly targeting and allocating resources to reduce these inequities. But in order to do that in a data-driven and sort of really justified way, they need information about what is the sort of severity of that inequity, where should they target replanting. And so as a first pass towards that, the urban ecology team at Google has been building accessible maps of tree canopy. And they're not the only people building tree canopy maps, but they are doing it at a pretty large scale. So for example, they are providing these now to, by the end of the year, I think it'll be 500 cities globally. And this is just an example of what that looks like. And then these tree canopy maps are actually then provided to nonprofits like Tree Equity Score, which is a nonprofit that works to explicitly build metrics of this equity of access to green space and provide those in an accessible and usable way to urban planners, but also to people who are lobbying for increased access or increased resources for the urban forest in their area, to try to combat these climate injustices and environmental injustices. But unfortunately, tree canopy prediction, while an amazing first step, is really not enough information to try to capture everything we might want to understand about urban forests. And so we really need both instance locations, so individual trees as opposed to just canopy, and identification of species, so that we can do things like estimate potential water retention in severe storms or in hurricanes, estimate future carbon sequestration, to be able to estimate the potential for heat reduction, given different projections of climate extremes, to be able to monitor species reaction and resilience to changing climate. So, what species should we plant given the fact that we know that we're going to see some amount of warming in many climates. So current estimates think that New York City within the next 50 years will have sort of climactic similarity to North Carolina now. And so the types of trees that thrive in those environments without a lot of resource invested in management are very different. And so if you're actually going to go out and invest money in planting trees, you really want to plant trees that are going to be resilient to a changing climate. And we'd also like to strategically plan our planting to try to maximize biodiversity. One of the things that is interesting about sort of historic urban planning commissions is they seem to think that streets were more beautiful if they planted all the same kind of tree along the entire street. That sort of similarity or the symmetry of that kind of uniformness of trees was something that a lot of cities really sought. But actually, monocultures are really not ideal for providing habitat or stable ecosystems. And so, can we really actually start strategically planning plant trees that are native to environments and that are going to support some of the regional biodiversity that might also be threatened by climate change and just by human encroachment on their habitat. But unfortunately, getting this information, like which trees are where, it's very expensive. It's something that many cities do. So Los Angeles, for example, is currently undertaking a tree census. This is a process that's taken a few years for them and is costing them millions of dollars. And so this is really just something that most cities actually can never afford to do. There are many cities across North America, across the US, which is where we sort of started our investigations, that really have never had a tree census in the history of the city. And that means that these are inequitable. There's inequity in terms of both the wealth that a city has, but also the prioritization of environment and of natural infrastructure in the political climate in that city. And also, because they're so expensive, they tend to be very out of date. So cities that do have tree censuses, sometimes they're 10 or 20 years old. And they're very limited in scope. So it might just be certain neighborhoods, for example, that have this information. And so, you know, just to move the needle, to try to get to a place where it's easier for people to advocate for themselves, advocate for their own access to green space, given all of the benefits that it comes with. We are very interested in trying to automate this process to make it more accessible and to make it be something that is where we can just reduce the cost of trying to continually monitor an urban forest. And, you know, we're not the only or the first to look at finding and categorizing trees. There was some early work actually that came out of Pietro Perona's lab at Caltech, where they showed that you could combine street level and aerial images, as well as map data from Google Maps, and get very nice results for common species of trees. So maybe the 40 most common species of trees. And they demonstrated this on, you know, this region in Pasadena. There's also been some very cool work looking at combining different views of ground level data from things like Street View or dash cams to build better detections of things like trees, but also like other urban scene objects. But the issue with a lot of these types of methods is that they build a training set for a given city. And then they build a model and they evaluate results in that city, and it works quite well. But what we found is that while these work on cities they've been trained on, they really struggle to generalize to cities that were not originally included in the training set. So for example, that model that works very well in Pasadena really struggled to generalize to Los Angeles. And in order to get a model that worked well in Los Angeles, from the group that had been working on this in Pietro's lab earlier, they had to invest a lot of resources in curating a ton of additional human expert labeled training data, which really makes this quite difficult to scale. And so what we're very interested in is, you know, how do we scale to more cities with minimal additional labeling? Really, like what are the things that we need to do to build systems that we can trust, that we can rely on, that generalize well? And this type of drop off in performance due to domain shift, particularly geospatial generalization or extrapolation, is a very, very common problem in the natural world, in biodiversity monitoring and environmental monitoring. And it's one that I'm intimately familiar with from previous work with, let's say, camera traps, static cameras, even bioacoustics, sonar cameras capturing fish in rivers. We continually see this challenge of generalizing to new places and to new things. And this is not just something that's faced in the environmental community. This domain shift challenge, both visual shift and subpopulation shift, so shifts in the distribution of what you see at a given city, are very significant computer science or computer vision or machine learning challenges right now in the community. I'm actually speaking on Saturday at a distribution shift workshop at NeurIPS. So these are big, open, and meaty computer science problems that we really need to tackle to be able to work or really just have impact in the environmental space. So as a first pass, in the last year, I worked at Google to try to build a data set that will allow us to really systematically study this generalization across North America and try to understand, as opposed to considering something like a static benchmark data set where you just train and evaluate and get one number, build a data set that enables you to really simulate or emulate, I suppose, the types of challenges you would see if you have some training data and now you're trying to generalize to different parts of the world and trying to understand what the best practices are to get models that work well in cities that maybe weren't originally seen during training, or potentially are in this low shot regime where you can actually start adding very minimal human labeled data into the system and figuring out, what are the best practices for using that human intervention. So this data set is 23 cities across North America. We've split those into 3 regions. So there's sort of West Coast, there's the central area, and there's East Coast. And it's covering about 340 different genera. We decided to release labels at the genus level as opposed to the species level because one, we verified with ecologists that genus level predictions were ecologically relevant and valuable. And 2, I don't know how much, if you guys work with biodiversity, you handle complicated taxonomies, but at the taxon level for trees in cities, what we found is there's an incredible amount of ambiguity and complexity around what someone considers to be a species. There's lots of hybrid species, cross species, subspecies, and a lot of human generated variability within a given species. And so it made it very difficult to map the labels together without a huge amount of expertise. And you'd really just be having to pick one person's idea over another. So this was a really conscious choice and one that was discussed with ecologists to be able to scale up effectively. We do hope eventually to move back down to the species level, particularly for very common species or species of interest that are maybe at risk of like some sort of invasive pest. But for now, we have genus level labels. And then in this data set, we have 2.6 million tree records. So these are the position and the genus of trees. And that is the entirety of the tree record for all of those 23 cities. And then there's about 1 million trees that have imagery associated. And here what you're looking at is the types of imagery we have. So it's aerial data as well as this ground level data coming from Google Street View. And this data set really captures a lot of the interesting structure that we often see in natural world data. So it's long-tailed, which means that a lot of the data is coming from just a few frequent species. We've sort of following the Elvis model, which is a common long-tailed computer science data set. We've broken this down into frequent, common, and rare classes so that you can actually striate your evaluation and try to understand how the commonality of a given species affecting performance. And so you can see here we have, some subset of classes that have over 10 to the 4th species, and then here we've common is from 100 up to 10,000, and then rare is very rare, so less than 100 training examples in many of these cases. And then we also see these this taxonomic structure. So here what you're looking at is the structure of the taxonomic tree for the categories in the data set. And this taxonomic structure is also something that is not unique to natural world categories, but tends to be available and accessible in really interesting ways in data sets like this one, but also like iNaturalist, for example. And it's taxonomic structure that you could actually potentially capture and could be quite useful when you're actually trying to make predictions. And I think there's one of the things I think is very interesting from a research perspective is thinking about how to adapt these sort of standard off-the-shelf, image in, result out computer vision models to spaces that have significant structure in the domain. Like, how do we capture that structure and bring it back into our methods to try to make best use of the information that we have? And one of the other things that's interesting here, you'll see, is that this tree is also very imbalanced. So there are some taxa that have, many leaf nodes and some that are really just singletons. And so here's just a look at what this imagery looks like. One thing that's important to point out is that to preserve personal privacy, in order to publish the data, we had a manual verification that we've blurred all pixels that are not trees, sky, or ground in the data set. And this was a necessary condition to publish this data. And this is the largest Google Street View data set that's ever been published by an order of magnitude, at least. And so a big part of that was really working with the legal team to try to make sure that we were mitigating as much as possible any potential privacy concerns with the data. So we have this street level data where we have blurred out sort of what's not trees. And then we also have aerial data for each tree. And the way that this data was curated is we took tree censuses from cities that had actually generated them. So now we have a latitude, a longitude, and a genus of tree. And then we scraped aerial data where the centroid of that image is the sort of location of the tree. And then we also went into the Street View data set, or the sort of Street View imagery that's available. And we found images that where the tree of interest was in the field of view, was close to the center, and was not too far away or too close, because we found that both of those scenarios gave you pretty weird data that was difficult to deal with. And so the data does have quite a few challenges because we're curating it through this process that's coming from tree censuses that might not always be up to date. So for example, here what we're looking at is one case where we have a labeled tree. If you go back in the time-lapse function on Google Street View, you can see the tree did used to be there, but now it's dead. So since this image was taken, the tree died and now it's gone, but there was, of course, a labeled tree in the census data because it hadn't been updated. And here what you're looking at, this is Seattle. This is where I grew up. So here's, Lake Union here, and here's, anyway, this is Seattle. And then what you've got here is we're showing just the different years and what data was when sort of the tree was last verified. And so you can really see, even just looking back 4 years, that the way that Seattle is maintaining a semi-accurate tree census is they're targeting neighborhoods in a sort of systematic way. And so some neighborhoods, really haven't been targeted for over 5 years. And so that's where you have this sort of these variations in data age that are actually contributing potentially to how accurate that data might be. The other challenge is localization accuracy. So one of the things we provide in the Street View data is based on the pose of the camera, the sort of X position that should associate with the location of the tree in the original tree census. You can see they're not always perfect. So here, I would say that this is maybe a meter off. This is looking at different views of the same tree and looking at sort of that location that was observed. And so the location accuracy is not always perfect. We have these distribution shifts. And the interesting thing with urban tree data is that it's not just naturally occurring distribution shift, which is sort of what you might see in a wilderness forest, where you can reasonably think about things like species distributions based on environmental covariates. In cities, you have people planting palm trees in Vancouver, BC. So there's this kind of man-made contributions to the distribution that are not easily mappable directly to something like the local climate or the local ecosystem. And the other thing that's quite interesting is there's some sort of like social and historical distribution shifts due to like how old the city is and who were sort of the original founders of a city, because different cultures had different preferences around what types of trees they thought were sort of the best trees to plant in cities. So cities that were maybe originally Spanish sometimes have different distributions of trees than cities that were originally English, for example, which is fascinating, but something that's definitely makes it more complicated to capture something like a geospatial prior in a city where you have this human intervention. We also have big challenges due to temporal changes in foliage. It's much easier to categorize a species of tree in the summer than it is in the winter, particularly for deciduous trees. And we don't actually necessarily get to choose when the Google Street View cars drive by. So we did optimize for trying to collect data during the summer when possible, but it's not always available. It's very difficult to categorize young trees. So here, this is a tree of interest, and you can see that it's at this point, it kind of just looks like a bush. And so we found that that's another factor that makes this quite challenging, is changes through the age of the tree can really make it hard to figure out what you're looking at. And some of the data can be quite imperfect. So you'll have things like significant occlusion from maybe cars or sort of the angle of the camera. And all of these things are really challenges that affect our ability maybe to do this really well, but also kind of relevant challenges for a lot of these types of real world problems. We often don't have data that's as well curated as ImageNet. And so what we found, if we really break this down and try to benchmark performance on this data set, is that sort of unsurprisingly, most of the time, models trained on the full data set. So the way we structured this here, we have 3 cities, Pittsburgh, Boulder, and Santa Monica, 1 for each region, that are completely held out from training. So these are not seen at all during training. There's absolutely no training data. And then for every other city, we have a train test split that's spatial. So what we found is that if you do a random split, you actually can very easily memorize things like what a certain street looks like. And then because they tend to plant the same tree all along the street, you get like maybe sort of falsely good results. But so we spatially split the data within the city. So now you have sort of a training area and a testing area for each city. And so what we see is that if you train on all the sort of non-holdout cities, so everything except for Santa Monica, Boulder, and Pittsburgh, the training sets for all of those, that model tends to do much better than maybe a model that was only trained on that specific city's training set or only on the region, but that's not universally true. So actually for Santa Monica, for Cupertino, and for Calgary, so some of these cities, we really do see better results, slightly better results coming from a regional model, which is interesting and really sort of points to that it's maybe not as simple when you have these types of distribution shifts as just like more training data is better. And then part of what might be causing this is really these distribution shifts across cities. So what we're looking at here is we just have sort of colored dots for the 10 most common species or genera of trees. And what you're seeing is kind of these shifts in color that are this really nice visual representation of how different these cities are, just in terms of the distribution of what's seen at those cities. And so one of the things that we did is we really took a really pairwise sort of exploration of this. And we looked here on the left, this is looking at the L1 distance between normalized per genus distributions. So we took each city and we look at the distribution for its training sort of region and its test region, which are not always identical, which is why this diagonal is not completely black. And we look at, we normalize that, based on sort of the number of trees, and then we look at the distance between those distributions, between every pair of train and test set. And what you start to see, here these lines are sort of splitting the different regions, west, central, and east. And you start to see this sort of block-like structure that forms where there are actually some very strong similarities between some cities and dissimilarities between others, and they can be somewhat regional. And if we then look at a similar a similar sort of visualization, but now we're looking at the accuracy of a model trained, for example, on Vancouver and tested on Vancouver, or trained on Vancouver and tested on Surrey, which is nearby. We start to see quite a similar kind of block-like structure in that data. Now, it's not identical, but there's definitely some similarity. And so one of the things that I think is very interesting to try to dig into or study in the future is, one, this does seem to point to, if you understand the distribution of trees at a new city, then you might be able to build some intuition about how well a model could be, could be expected to work. So this ability to start doing an efficient job of trying to understand whether it's worth deploying a model in a given place or not, that's valuable. But then this begs the question of how do you do distribution testing in a new city? How do you figure out what the distribution of trees is efficiently? Which is a whole other very classic statistical problem. Digging in a little more, we're looking at here, this is now the training, if we train on each of these cities, now we're looking at the distribution of performance over all of the test data. And the red stars here are corresponding to the sort of self-test performance. So how well do you do on your own test set? And then we sorted by that. And so what you can see here is that really, the distribution over performance is much higher from stuff trained on this full data set. It really does point to the value of, diverse and large scale data curation. But it's also very interesting to look at which cities generalize and which don't, because it's not just as simple as more data, right? For example, if you look at, let's say New York, like New York generalizes quite well and actually sort of has a similar generalization performance across the data set to training on every single city on the West Coast, which is fascinating. But Los Angeles, which has a similar number of training examples, really generalizes significantly less well here. And so, really thinking about and digging in and trying to understand this variability and generalizability, I think is, again, another important piece of the puzzle as we move forward and try to build models that do generalize well, or at least understand when we should or shouldn't trust a model for setting something like environmental policy. And we found that combining information across views really does help. So one thing that we would love to see is we would love to see our ability to predict the sort of species of trees from aerial data being very good, because aerial data is very accessible. It's something that tends to be available at scale. It's somewhat simpler, and it would really be great if that was possible. What we're looking at here is that our ability to accurately predict species from aerial data is maybe half or even less than that, what it's possible to do with simple models with street level data. And I think this is, again, it's what I was saying at the beginning, this interesting question of, given the space of all of the different types of data that are being collected, and that's increasing really dramatically for the environment, how do we decide what data to collect, what data to prioritize, and how do we start to understand the value of that data in something like a machine learning or predictive system, and really try to make best use of the data that we have, because we can't get the same spatial scale from street level images, because there are trees in parks, there are trees in backyards, there's lots of trees that are never visible from the street. So if we really want to map the entire city, we need to be able to use aerial imagery alone some of the time. But then how do we make use of the street level data, and can we actually propagate confidence or uncertainty to get better predictions of trees that are not visible from the street, given the input of some street level data when it's available, this more valuable street level data? We also see that, and I should clarify that this table is looking at class average accuracy. So this is basically we're averaging across the class set. So the reason these numbers are very low is because of that long tail in many senses. This is a pretty common thing. And we have in the paper a breakdown of performance where you can see that actually for common species, the numbers are very good and sort of good enough to be usable. So we're looking at deployment, they're in the 90s. But averaging across the class set, the numbers are much lower.
Sarah, a question?
Yeah.
In the previous slide, you reported a number with AR. What does AR mean?
Average recall.
Okay, thank you.
Which is sort of similar to class average accuracy, right? I mean, if you do recall if you say, okay, for any given set of data that is corresponding to ground truth labels for a class, then you're sort of, it corresponds to an accuracy metric, a recall metric just for a single class. So yeah, average recall. Sorry, thanks for asking. I should clarify more. Here, SL means street level, A means aerial. Anyway, and so what we also found is that increasing the number of street level views and ensembling across that does give you a boost in performance. But actually, we do get our best performance. It's not a huge benefit, but it is there by combining aerial and street level. And this is, I think this could be much higher. Right now, this is a very naive baseline. It's just using the predictions from street level data and aerial data, and then combining those with a simple mixture of experts model, where basically, and this is what we're breaking down on the bottom here, we're learning based on the training set a weight to pay for aerial data for each category. So, and what we're breaking down is, so now here, this is the log training count. This is like the number of training examples for a category. Here's the aerial weight on the x-axis. What you can see is there's a lot of genera of data where we basically are ignoring the aerial information entirely. But then there is this set of species where the aerial information is sometimes even, close to half of the prediction. And this really points to that it's actually maybe more valuable for some species than others. For example, things like this Saragrus, this palm tree, from street level data, a lot of palm trees look like telephone poles. They're just, you don't even see the top, right? And so it's interesting to see how these types of data have differing value based on interest. And particularly for some species, it's very valuable. And it's also interesting that we found that our best performance, now it's not, these are not huge improvements here, but we do get better performance if we let that mixture of experts be region specific. So we actually are sort of learning how much to use aerial versus not on a regional, like at a regional scale. And I think it might actually be true, though we haven't done these experiments, that you might even be able to get a little bit more of a boost if you do that on a per city level. Which is interesting. And finally, here just is, again, I was talking about how there really are a lot of these trade-offs. And this is specifically looking at this long tail problem. Here, we're looking at exploring the effects of what's called logit-adjusted loss, which is a sort of recent technique to try to handle imbalance in data and try to push to get some better or increased performance on data that is less frequently seen during training. And we're breaking this down. We've looked at different values of, there's in the logit adjusted loss, there is this smoothing constant that we've added in that is this like C, which is basically just a buffer on how much you're going to allow this to smooth the loss function. And now we're actually exploring this parameterization of this sort of smoothing constant that we've added into logit adjusted loss. And so here, really what I want to break down is the fact that there's kind of no free lunch in long-tailed problems. So this is, for all of them, here's frequent, common, and rare. And, as this value goes from 1 up to 100,000, we're basically just adjusting the amount of smoothing that we're seeing in this logit space. And so if the number is quite high, we're getting a little bit closer to just like the loss function being somewhat standard. And you start to see that the frequent classes then will do much better. And then if you go to the rare classes, for example, we really start to see how this low shot problem is so severely unsolved. And I know Olaf was talking right before we started about how he's been exploring some low shot learning in bioacoustic data. But here, you can just see there is so much room for improvement for these like nearly 100 categories that are rare. The performance of the model on those categories is almost non-existent. But then also the other interesting thing here is that like we really, these are just for looking at an example of cities. We really, you don't see, like if you want to get any performance at all, you will see sort of some increases in performance based on, using this smoothing. But there's no free lunch. Like you can't get better performance on rare categories without sacrificing some performance on common or frequent categories. Anyway, I would not say this is a solution by any means. I think it's more of an interesting exploration, and it's kind of just showing that, in many ways, it's very difficult to perform well on categories that are low shot. And in some ways, I think this is like there's certain cases where rare examples are very important. Particularly, we're talking about things like endangered species. But when we're actually thinking about sort of the overall ecosystem, the contribution of a few very rare categories is maybe less significant, kind of unknown, but it's maybe less significant than the contribution of the sort of set of common categories of trees in the cities. So in some ways, I think it might be valuable to think about where to put priorities in terms of what urban ecologists actually need. And depending on the ecologist, that will be different, right? And so, how do you build a model that works well for one ecologist who really just wants to understand ecosystem stability and is much more interested in the vast majority of trees that are common, versus an ecologist who's explicitly studying a very specific and rare species of tree. So currently under exploration, we're digging into incorporating LiDAR. We have at Google, we have LiDAR data for the ground level imagery, and we're trying to do a better job of instancing the trees to try to help handle the fact that this is truly kind of a multi-label problem, and it can be a bit ambiguous as to which tree is actually the tree of interest. And so we want to do better localization and have better understanding of which tree is which across the views from aerial to the ground. So we're taking sort of a 3D clustering approach in the LiDAR point cloud space and trying to get better instancing by incorporating pixel level information. We're also exploring some of these dimensions of geographic and temporal context, particularly in these settings where you have human intervention that makes it sort of not as simple as a wilderness like species distribution model. We're exploring self-supervision, particularly trying to leverage agreement across views as a weak signal to build representations in cities that haven't been seen during training, to try to figure out if that helps us generalize. And we're looking at multi-label losses to try to, again, handle the fact that we don't have explicit localization in this data set. The data is public, it's been released. And so, please, if you're interested, I think it's really fun to play with. So please check it out. And then, before I wrap up, I just wanted to point out, that a lot of these challenges are really open challenges in computer vision or AI or machine learning for ecology. Things like this global and local domain shift, these long-tail distributions, the fact that we have sparse, low quality, sometimes multimodal and heterogeneously sampled multimodal data, not just sort of a video with audio. And the fact that we have this need for not just sort of results on static data sets, but to be moving towards really understanding how AI can be used in an interactive or participatory manner with ecologists to be able to make more informed decisions and set policy. we want to make sure that the technology we develop is equitable. One dimension of this, for example, is that as machine learning models get larger and more expensive to use, that really restricts access to those models for many of our collaborators in, let's say, like Africa or South America, who don't have access to the scale of compute that's needed to train something like a really massive transformer. And really, there's also carbon resources that are, that are being burned to train these very large models. And so I think we should think about and try to push for models that are more robust to hyperparameters, that need less tuning, and that are more lightweight, just from a deployment perspective and an accessibility perspective. And there's also, though this is getting better, we have limited interdisciplinary capacity. And we really, I think, to really make a difference on these problems, it really is valuable to really embed yourself in the domain, but also collaborate really directly with people in the domain and start to teach them and empower them to be using machine learning for themselves. And so trying to expand this interdisciplinary capacity, I think, is really exciting. If you are interested in taking part, we have a Slack channel called AI for Conservation that's got over 1,000 now global researchers. It's one of my favorite communities on the internet. And so you can get an invite by emailing aiforconservation@gmail.com. And finally, I run a summer school on computer vision methods for ecology. And we are currently accepting applications for next year's school. This is really aimed not necessarily at computer scientists, but aimed at quantitative ecologists or conservation scientists at, in graduate school, postdocs, early faculty, at governmental agencies from, worldwide. And we bring them to Caltech for a 3-week, very intensive crash course in practical applied computer vision for their own research questions. So these are some of the questions from the 2022 school that people brought, everything from understanding walrus populations from satellite imagery to recognizing beaked whale species echolocations in sonar. And we really did see, all the participants really came in, and by the time they left, they had written their own code and trained their own models, evaluated them, thought about deployment. It's really fun. So the applications are due December 15th. If there's anyone in Sweden who wants to come join us, we would be thrilled to have you. And at that, I'll take questions.
Great, thank you. Do we have some questions?
Yes. I was wondering, maybe you mentioned that and I missed it, but your data set relies on the cities where you did a census. And
well, not we're the city did a census, but yeah.
And yeah, that are wealthy cities. So I guess there is a bias in your data set for wealthy cities, right? And you also mentioned that different cultures plant different trees. Do you have any vision for the future, how you want to address this?
Yeah. So I think in order to start to expand to cities that don't already have labeled training data, one of the most important things is understanding really, okay, so now potentially I think a path forward is you build a predictive map for a new city that will be imperfect in some way. And then you actually try to target local communities and empower local communities to work with something like iNaturalist, through something like a BioBlitz, to actually go out and collect information for trees that we are less certain about. And here, certainty, you need to be quite careful, because particularly when you're doing something out of domain, you can't rely necessarily on the model confidence to be a perfect like monotonic mapping to like your real uncertainty. But actually try to do targeted verification in a striated way to try to build both an understanding of how well is the model working already and what is the most efficient way to incorporate enough training data to get a map that is accurate for this new city. And there's actually a group at MIT so I think they're in civil and environmental engineering, that have an existing project where they're trying to build maps of urban forests across South America, particularly with this community science-driven approach. And so I've been talking to them about, how we might actually try to better prioritize the efforts of the people on the ground by building maps of these cities as a starting point, and then going in and trying to iteratively get to a point where they're reliable enough to use. And I really think that type of participatory system, one where like humans, which are much better at generalizing than any machine learning model, are really helping or taking part in getting models to generalize well and getting them to work in new areas. I really think that's the only path forward. I have not seen a single purely methodological approach that really handles domain shift well enough to be deployed or used.
Yeah, but that sounds like a really great way of dealing with that. So awesome, thanks.
We have a raised hand from Sepide.
Hello, thank you for the interesting talk. I'm wondering, have you ever thought of, instead of finding the diverse enough training set, you try to map different, same type of the trees from different locations first, and learn that kind of mapping first, and then on top of that, you do some sort of classification. In this way, you have a higher chance of generalizing for small scale kind of cities and so on. Or
so do you mean taking more of a contrastive approach?
Yes,
exactly. So just trying to find, with unlabeled data, trying to find within a given city trees that we think are the same versus different. Yeah, so we're exploring this right now. A bit, like trying, particularly when we're thinking about this generalization question, and some of that self-supervision that I was talking about. We are looking at trying to figure out, because it is easier to say, I think these are the same tree versus exactly. I know what type of tree this is. Yeah. So yeah, we are exploring that. We don't have any sort of preliminary results yet. And I do think there's kind of some value in because you have these visual shifts between cities, like doing this within a given city, because there's a lot of these shared environmental characteristics, there should be some similarity then in that feature space. We're also thinking about this when we're talking about the trees in cities that don't have ground level views. Because if you look at like a single aerial tile, for example, these large tiles that are collected by EOS, that's like this snapshot in space and time. Mm-hmm. And so maybe there's sort of confounding weather effects or what have you, or lighting that is maybe different from the last snapshot you have from aerial data, or one that was taken in another city. But what's true is that in this snapshot in space and time, there is similarity between the same species of trees. So, when you're talking about now we build some map of what we think all these trees are. Now, if you do have ground level imagery for some of them, can you then propagate that to the similar trees from the aerial data? Mm-hmm. But still very much just under exploration. I think it's a great idea though.
Thank you.
Is this, did you consider something like causal representation learning, like invariant risk minimization, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, ERM, so we haven't tested it with this data set yet. It's on the to-do list. I think it can actually be really like a very nice, straightforward technique that does tend to help sometimes with generalization. But I wouldn't, intuitively, I don't expect it to sort of solve the problem. It just might be a contributing factor that helps to improve slightly. And that's just coming from the experience I had. We built this data set called Wilds, which is explicitly like a large scale data set covering distribution shifts across lots of different applications, and trying to really capture the fact that a lot of pre-existing data sets that were exploring domain shift, distribution shift challenges were really highly curated sort of toy data sets, and they weren't really maybe capturing the types of domain shift we see in the real world. And so in that wilds data set, we have this leaderboard across, lots of different types of applications of domain shift. And fascinatingly, ERM actually outperforms for these real world domain shift problems often many of the very fancy modern techniques that are intending to handle domain shift. So I think it can be a really powerful tool, but in not a single of those applications did we see ERM sort of make enough of a contribution so that you could just be like, all right, well, that's good. We'll just use this model now out of domain. So I don't know, maybe the hope is that something like that could be incorporated into a larger system.
Cool. Do we have some more questions? Otherwise, I have one more. So the blurring, how did you, what effects did you see with the blurring? I suppose that you used the blurred pictures in your experiments as training.
So we did both. Yeah, we did both. And we found that the performance was the same, which is interesting. And then we've also, I've just qualitatively, or like this, just in sort of like one-off, like small sets of data, explored performance on unblurred images using a model trained on blurred data. And similarly, it didn't affect the performance as much as I thought it might. So who knows? I wonder, I haven't done it yet, but I wonder if you sort of like look at maybe some of the maybe a heat map of where the models are sort of focusing on. If they're really focusing on the trees, which would ideally be what you care about, then maybe the blurred pixels would matter less. But I often think there's a lot of, particularly these convolutional types of structures, there's a lot of, actually maybe even more with visual transformers, there's a lot of complex, like sort of far distant information that gets pulled in. So I don't know how really interpretable those heat maps are. But yeah, I didn't see much difference in performance between the system trained with non-blurred data, the system trained with blurred data, and even using, because I was a bit worried, like, oh, well, if we build this thing, we publish this data set where all the data is blurred, like now will this only work on, images of trees where we blurred everything else? And it seems like the answer is no. It seems like similar, but.
Cool. One last question from Hamid Reza.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering what type of information about the forest properties are you looking for and predicting? For example, in sequestration phenomena, we are looking for some specific parameters or variables from the forest, or for example, for wind simulation, we are looking for a specific characteristic of the forest. Do you expect to have some prediction about the, for example, leaf area index, about the forest height, or is just about the species, that there are some species here and there? And also, what about the impact of the season in winter or in summer, and variation of the leaf area? And also, what about the advantage of this method? Also, the last question is with respect to the LAS data, the laser airborne scan data, because it's like a cloud data, and then we can extract all the information with respect to the all ground obstacles, all the forest height, and also the forest leaf area index, or plant area index, let's say.
Okay, that was a lot of questions. I will try to work through them. So this is just, step one here is that we were interested specifically in looking at species and detecting trees, so finding sort of the locations of trees. And this was based on discussions with urban ecologists about sort of like what we think we have labeled data for at scale. And so, working from these tree censuses where we have this information, and really being able to explore in this systematic way these trade-offs and these generalization challenges. So we're focused first on species ID, but I completely agree with you that there are so many more dimensions of interest. And I actually hope, we don't have labels for a lot of those different types of information that might be interesting. But I do hope that this data set could be a starting point, because it has so much diversity, where then if you incorporate more of that information, because we have lat long, you know, for all these images, you could start building systems that try to predict some of these things, like maybe tree height. One thing that I think is maybe even potentially more likely to be capturable from this data set is an estimate of DBH, diameter at breast height, which is another sort of quantity that a lot of ecologists are very interested in when they're looking at change over time. But yeah, so the data set currently doesn't have labels for any of these things, but I would love to see, you know, how this type of data could be scaled to include some of these other dimensions of things that are interesting for specific research questions down the line. Particularly, like, how do you sort of trade off this versus, you know, LAS? Like, I don't know, it's complementary, right? One of the reasons I wanted to explore this is because Google has Street View data for every city on Earth. So the data is already there. We don't need to pay to collect new data or a new type of data. And so there's this potential for scale there that I think is very interesting. And one of the things that I've found as we're looking at a lot of these environmental problems is like this generalization question that exists everywhere. And the models that are built, one of the things I really liked about the paper that we wrote actually here is I really did I've tried very hard to do a very good literature review and really break down like all of the different ways that people are trying to study urban and wilderness forests. And again, even in the spaces where they're building models to look at forests from these much more sort of complex, you know, massively hyperspectral with LiDAR, with everything data sets, if they're using machine learning, they have predictive models. Those models still don't generalize. So you still have this problem of, if you build a model that works in one region, you need to somehow retrain it or adapt it for a new region. And then the data doesn't necessarily exist for everywhere already. So I think both are really valuable. I think maybe if you have that data additionally, maybe you could even combine it with ground level data and do even better. Again, it's just this question of how do we make use of the data that we have in hand? But yeah, I think somehow in some ways they're complementary. And if you have the funding, or if you already have these other types of data that are capturing much more detailed information from the air, it would be interesting to then explore the trade-off there in terms of the value of these different types of data, because we found that ground level data was much more valuable from at least from a species prediction standpoint than aerial data, even when it was very high resolution EOS data. Yeah. What do you think?
I think your job is very valuable, because I'm looking from my perspective in terms of the wind resource assessment. And in the wind resource assessment for development of any type of wind farm, we are dealing with the surface ground roughness. And one of the things is that to take into account the impact of the forest with respect to the height and with respect to the density, or let's call it in a formal way, leaf area density. And also, as you mentioned, the diameter of the burst. So in that perspective, for some area that there are no data in terms of the LAS data, because LAS is very accurate, and there are the very developed method in order to extract the interesting parameters. But for some reason, for some region that we do not, and we have a lack of information from LAS. If we can have this type of information, then based on the tree species, based on the training data, then we can have some type of rough estimation. And in that perspective, we can have a very good information to predict the surface roughness. And then we can go more towards the more accurate wind resource assessment as a bottleneck of any type of wind farm development. So I think you're doing a very well job. Yes.
Well, thank you. No, I think that's really interesting. And again, you know, I was saying at the beginning, like, you know, the reason people want to know locations or species of trees is there's like, you know, this whole list of potential downstream modeling that they might want to do, right? Maybe I want to predict heat islands, or maybe I want to predict water retention. But I think you're right that a lot of those models, there are additional factors that we would love to also be able to predict at scale. Anyway, very interesting to think about sort of maybe the bycatch, or sort of the way to take systems that were built for one type of thing and then generate the needed inputs for all of these different downstream models. Cool.
Yes, thank you very much.
Great. So thank you, Sara Beery, for this intriguing presentation. We'll come back, everybody, next week, December 8th. We'll have William Lidberg from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences talking about geographical intelligence. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you for inviting me. I had fun.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.